All right, if I could invite the panelists to please take a seat up here. We're going to enter our question and answer part of the session. For the live audience, if you have a question, please raise your hand. For our good friends who are streaming this event on the internet, you can type them in on Zoom. Why do I feel like Oprah Winfrey right now? If you were a tree, no, I'm just kidding. So I actually had 3 questions, and then I kind of narrowed it down. So, Heather, there's one thing that you said that really was trying to summarize the question I was going to ask. And I'm paraphrasing because it took me a little while to write it down. But something to the effect like, you're the ancestor to the ancestors' prayers.
I think I said that we are each the answer to our ancestors' prayers.
Could you elaborate on that?
I think about that is not necessarily in response to me as a professional museum person, but it's also in response to the fact that, 100 years ago, 100 and almost 200 years ago, just to give you an idea, the Chickasaw people were reduced down to 250 warriors was all that was left. Sorry. I cry.
First
time I haven't cried on stage with Joe in like 10 years.
So I've been to several conferences with my dear friend Heather, and it's not a good conference unless Heather cries.
Shit.
If Heather doesn't cry, don't go back next year.
These are really personal things for us.
Yeah.
These are not like ethereal, like abstract ideas. This is like our freaking survival, right? And if we don't hold on to our stories, and if we don't hold on to carrying that for the future, then that there's the risk that in the future that won't happen. And I am both eternally and deeply grateful to those 250 warriors who fought to hold on to what we have now. And we can look back across those 200 years and we can think about all the atrocities, right? And I totally am with you, sister, on the whole genocide shit. Like, that stuff is just gotta be, we have to share the burden of that memory with the rest of America so that we are not the only members of American society holding on to the difficult stories of our indigenous experience. And it is through that resilience and persistence of our ancestors, holding on to those stories of our creation, holding on to our language, holding on to our songs and our ceremonies, and also just the way of being. I mean, you will not go to any place else in the country and not be treated, there's no way, I can promise you. If you come into Chickasaw country, you are going to be treated well because that is how we are, and that is how we have been taught to be. But we are also steely tough, and we've had to develop that and cultivate that in every generation in order to create the future. And that future is now. But in the same way that those ancestors were praying for me, the generation now, I'm praying for that future. And I'm thinking about that. And when we were building First Americans Museum's exhibitions, I mean, my team, we were an incredibly prayerful group. We were also, let me just say a little bit, if I could, about that process. To build an exhibition that speaks and creates space for our indigenous future, we had to subject ourselves to the historical trauma of all of that nastiness every day. And we had to come to a point as 11 members from different tribes. This is not some kind of like, what did you say, rainbows and sunshine. I mean, our world, and we were working out of a double wide trailer. It had 2 bathrooms, so it was pretty nice, but it was still a double wide trailer, and we'd come together and we had to wrestle with which of these stories, when you have 100 stories to tell, which of these stories gets told? And you know that there's the risk that if that story doesn't get selected, there's the risk that it may not ever end up in a museum, or it may not get told outside of the family that has to carry that on. These are things that we wrestled with, and so our conversations were incredibly contentious. They were incredibly aggravated because we were aggravating a history that we felt challenged to figure out how to tell that in a museum. I will tell you that there's a space in our museum. You guys all have to come. There's a few people in here that have been there, I know, but the rest of you need to come because there's a couple of places. I showed you that black screen where that gentleman is speaking. We have the lights dimmed in there intentionally because people, not just Native people come out of there crying because they don't know how awful these things are. And we carry that as people. So we're, through these exhibitions and through our work as Indigenous individuals, we're thinking about what is the space that we want, not just in 10 years or not in just 20 years, but what is the space we want in 100 years? And if we don't lay a foundation, as has been done by Rick West and all the good people, your dad, all the good people that have done the work that was needed to be done against every adversarial motivation, then that future won't be possible. And so, yes, we're the answer to our ancestors' prayers, but we are also now praying as good ancestors for what that future will be.
Thank you. So, Josie, I think out of all of us, you're probably the only one who works directly with objects, photographs, etc., from your people, right? So we talked about, Heather just talked about a little bit of sort of that balance between being a professional and also a personal. How do you balance that out?
I don't know if I do.
Okay, next question. Because it's really, and this sort of goes back to the previous one, it's a big responsibility, right?
It is.
And it's a big responsibility to visit our wonderful non-Native friends who come and visit us. And also it's that responsibility to our neighbors and our ancestors.
Right. So for me, the needs of our community, the tribal members, come first. First and foremost, that's who I serve. And it may be different if I was in a different institution or in a different role, but really, my community comes first. That's how I was raised. That's why I chose to move back home. And then the needs of other people can come second. We do serve a number of non-Native students. I have library and archive students from the University of Madison who help document and archive all of our photography exhibit or collections. And we also work with archaeology students from the University of La Crosse to help catalog and whatever they are doing with our projectile points. Some of them are studying them just from one specific time period, and they go way over my head, but I'm glad they're there. But really, if tribal members are looking for specific things within our collection or within our community, my role is really just kind of a guide to help them figure out what they need. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, that answered. Thank you. Thank you. So, Patricia, I think as you sort of look at the landscape of Native people in museums, particularly within a curatorial position, I think it's pretty clear, being at the Met, you probably have the highest profile within that case, within that sense, with a lot of responsibility. And as you had mentioned, the work that you've been doing and the direction you've been taking the Met is just like night and day, just night and day. So as we try to negotiate the space, as you mentioned, negotiating, working with multiple tribes from all of Native America, right? Negotiating with administration, because we all know no matter what grade of a museum that you work in, you never always get what you want, unfortunately. But so, negotiating with administration, negotiating with all of these things. Having said that, we also, behind us, or next to us, I guess you could say, we see a younger generation of Native curators who are moving up. So based on all of your experience, what advice would you give?
Is this on? I always struggle with the what advice would you give younger generations questions because it has so much weight on it. And I'm also in a very prominent position, as you mentioned. And so I want to be thoughtful and careful about what I say. But I think that understanding that every institution is very different, has its own unique culture, but also deeply ingrained histories. Understanding that this work is not a one-size-fits-all approach is really important. And also in regard to curatorial work, specifically at an institution like the Met, again, foregrounding Indigenous perspectives and needs and voices within everything that we're doing now. The Met is not the same institution that it was 5 years ago, and I know you and I have talked about that. So many changes have occurred, and yet we're very aware that this is a process of growth that takes time, that takes a lot of input directly from communities, which is what we're doing at this time. We're undergoing a major inventory of all of our Native American collections in consultation with communities who are represented in our collections. And this takes great time and great care and a lot of listening. So I would say also listening is incredibly important. And one of the things that I have expressed many times in my position to my colleagues, when words like, well, you're the expert, or phrases like, you're the expert, I've consistently had to say, I'm not comfortable with that. I am not the expert. The communities are the experts, and we need to listen to what the communities have to say and to how they want to present this work. And so I think it's really important to understand that that's what we're doing right now. It's taking a lot of time, but also that we're in the process of developing the first Native American art initiative at the Met, which will, in the next few years, involve an entire team of people, not just one person who will be engaged in a lot of this care. So, but again, starting during a pandemic was an incredible challenge. Organizing my first installation on a laptop in my farm in Wisconsin, not too far from Black River Falls. But all of these things, they slowed down that process, and I know a number of you can relate to this. But also it was an opportunity to pause and to really think about where the gaps are and to really understand that all of this, all of the theories that are out there about decolonization or indigenization or why aren't things happening as quickly as possible, you begin to understand how important it is to pause and take your time with all of this work and not to engage in reactive change because you're receiving public criticism or on social media or in the public eye or all of these things, but to really feel strongly in what you feel is right and what the communities are telling you and following that route. And that's what I've been doing, working with a great team of people. You're looking at your watch, so I'll stop talking.
No. I was checking my heart rate. All right, do we have any questions? Any questions from the audience? Any questions? It's always the chairman of the board.
Well, as the chairman, I have to also think about audiences. We've heard a great discussion this morning from when Rick started talking about sometimes the process is as important as the product, to discussions about the product and the interweaving community into the efforts. But now what about those audiences? And who are they? And how do you expand them beyond your narrow base? This is a question the Autry has, Joe, as you know as well. Bringing them back after COVID, but also finding them and empowering knowledge and all the things that we want to do. I don't want us to just be confined to our own communities. I want to know who those audiences are, and I thought maybe the three of you could have some ideas of who they are and how to reach them.
I have thoughts. So, one of the things that First Americans Museum has realized since we've been open, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, Jim. What is the numbers right now? We've had over 70,000 visitors, 75,000 in the first 6 months of being opened during a freaking pandemic. I'm working really hard to quit cussing, so I'm very sorry about all this. I hear it slipping out. But I have to say the last 4 years have hardened me a little bit. But let me tell you about the people who are coming. They're not museum people. They're community members who have been waiting to be invited to a space. Museums have historically, museums are built out of this history of the colonial powers taking war trophies from indigenous communities across the globe, hoarding them, and then putting them on display. Museums have, for too long, been speaking about us without us. And in doing that, that without us wasn't just the people represented by those objects. It was everybody else that could see that they weren't in part of the elite power. This is a crux that museums as a field have arrived at. We created a space where people are welcomed. They're allowed to touch things. They're allowed to listen to things. They can hear them. They see people who look like them speaking in the galleries. And I don't just mean our Native American tribes from Oklahoma. I get emails from people who are passing through. Actually, I got an email from a young man who lives here in Los Angeles, and he was like, I was in your museum, and I did the trade network thing where we researched the trade networks cross-continentally. And he saw his own Tongva people represented on that map. And he said it was the first time he felt like he'd been represented in a museum, and it wasn't even in California. And it was really like, it meant something. So these museums have been built without us. And in doing so, now all the people with the money that have died off and aren't funding you, you're like wondering, well, where's the next group of people coming from? The question may or may not be motivated by money, but in my mind, it's linked to it. That money generation is dying off, and now you're wondering who is our audience and how do we get them to come in here? And I think the idea of holding on to the old regime of what museums has been has faded. It's time to reconsider what museums are to their communities. It's time to look at who your home base is. Who are your people right here? Talk to them, and Native people, other people, right? Jim and I field questions from the Black community. We do tours for our Asian community in Oklahoma, because we're all part of that land, and we understand that that relationship is key to everything that we do in the future. That's the thought I had.
Nobody wants to follow that up.
Okay, anybody else has a question? Oh, all right.
First of all, just a brief comment. You're all stunning as far as I'm concerned, and I appreciate what all of you said. And for me, it was very interesting that you hit all quarters. In other words, there's somebody who actually sits in the Met who's talking here, an institution that we do not necessarily associate, except in very distant ways with Native collections, Native people, et cetera. Somebody who's on the ground, right in the middle of it, in a tribal institution, community institution, and somebody who's a little bit different. I mean, it's an institution that has roots in the Native community and is implementing them. But in a way, it's emblematic of all the bases we have to start touching, I think, in straightening museums around about what we're doing. Now, I did have a specific question for you, Patricia, and that is that I, being at the NMAI, know the Dykers very well, and indeed it was their gift that in a way was generative in some ways, in sort of starting things down the road for the Met. And their aspiration was, and I know this from talking to them, you know, for a 20-year period or something, was that Native material be looked at as an important piece of American art. And more recently, I happen to have joined another museum board where there's a large Native collection, and there's a lot of debate about whether we want to do that, and this is amongst Native curators, whether that is what we should be doing, or does that reflect some kind of, quote, assimilation that we want to sort of stay clear of in terms of maintaining this very close connection between the Native community and the art. And I just wonder how you see that and how the Met sees that in putting together the work you are doing.
That's a big question, but one of the how should I say this? Coming to the Met with my background in training in fine arts, but also museum leadership, followed by my academic work, I'm able to see both sides. And so understanding the importance of what, for instance, the Dykers have this tremendous gift that they have offered, because this has helped to propel change at the Met at a speed that may not have happened in the past. Although the Dyker collection gets a lot of attention, the Met actually has 4 Native American collections and a number of items that have never been on view. In regard to the presentation of those items, whether they're presented as art or something more specific and more personal or deeply meaningful to the communities, I do reach out to communities to ask for their input and how they would prefer for items to be presented in gallery, or whether or not they should not be on view at all. And so that is something that I do, directly reaching out to community members. And so I do leave that up to community members, those types, because I think those decisions are very important. And although I have my own knowledge in regard to fine art and how it should be presented, I do respect each community and how they want to approach that. I don't know if that answers your question specifically. But we also are engaged across the Met, and this goes back to the audience question, with contemporary artists and their work. So for instance, the examples of the contemporary Native designers who I showed, that's reaching an entirely new audience for the Met. So the representation of 6 contemporary Native designers is something that hasn't happened in the history of the Met, even though the Costume Institute is now celebrating its 75th anniversary. And so that's a major change for the museum. And that was through a lot of collaboration, negotiation, all of these things that happen as part of the curatorial process. I think sometimes there's a fantasy that curatorial work is simply hanging, beautiful images on the wall or putting beautiful things on view, but there's a lot of negotiating across institutions, dealing with politics that are deeply ingrained within an institution. So you're consistently doing that type of work, also working with communities, in my own role, working with NAGPRA-related issues, and then in addition to your curatorial responsibilities. So there's a lot going on there that requires a team of people, which is what we're working on developing at this time. So I hope I answered your question. But
Heather, Josie, and Patricia, thank you so much for your time. Well, I was going to have some lunch. Sure. Well, hold on a second. You got it.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Okay, so for all the small tribal museums and cultural centers, how important is it that tribal leader, how important is tribal leadership? Is it a hindrance or is it beneficial? And how do we kind of get our tribal leaders on board with museums and cultural centers in the smaller tribes, because there's a million of them, but it's a challenge to get governance on board or acceptance, and ways to do that to propel this Native knowledge that we're striving for. And also, I think it would really help a next generation of museum, not only curators, but workers in general. So I would like some advice on how to get our tribal leadership on board. And for the successfuls, what is the ratio like from male to female leaderships? Are you ran by women, or are you run by, is it patriarchal or is it matriarchal leadership?
Ooh, okay. I can answer a little bit of this. So in the past, Ho-Chunk was matriarchal, and I will probably be disenrolled for saying that, but due to the process of colonization, we have become patriarchal, and part of that is a mode of survival. Obviously, if you need to negotiate with a dominating military, it is easier to have your warriors present you. So that is part of it. And today we are very patriarchal as a society and as a government. For my specific role, I had 40 years of people advocating for a tribal museum before I was even brought on board. And I really started off as an annoying 22-year-old on a letter writing campaign to my tribal government, followed up by going out into our community and finding the people that wanted to advocate for this space alongside of me. So it wasn't just a singular voice of me as an individual, but multiple community members that have come together that still serve as our advisory board, and that are really working to kind of propel our institution as an institution within a tribal government. So I relied on people like Anna Ray Funmaker, who has passed away, but she really led the kind of the drive to get a museum up and running for Ho-Chunk Nation, as well as the Talmadge family and a handful of others. And once you find those people within your community that are willing to help, it makes it so much easier. And I think a part of it as well with tribal government is you have to explain that the museum is not just for highlighting those stories of the past. Because within my slides, one of the things that I faced a lot of was people didn't want our objects just behind a case. We want to be able to use our items. We want to make sure that people know how to make them. We want to make sure that they're going to continue because our way of life itself is so important. And so having a space where we could not only highlight it, but also pass along those traditions to the future was really, really important to talk about.
I'm just going to add a quick comment, and that is that, not speaking on behalf of FAM, but on behalf of my own tribal community, one of the investments that our tribe made was looking at the economic factors for the motivations for cultural tourism within Oklahoma. And once that was identified, and it was not identified just by our tribe, but as the third largest, right behind, I think, the military and medical development or medical field, cultural tourism is the third largest economic generator in Oklahoma. When that was sort of raised and brought up to the attention of our tribal leadership, and whether we wanted to let someone else tell our story or whether we wanted to be the ones telling our story, that really shifted the sort of priority that was placed. And we now actually have 7 tribal museums in a 16-county district that our tribe has within our reservation. I would highly recommend looking at, it's not just museum chairmen who are motivated by money and the economic impacts, it's also our tribal leadership. And that really shifted the conversation within our community specifically.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your presentations. Really appreciate you.